Hi, I'm Susan Lewis from WRTI, and I'm here with Sam Katz and Jennifer Lin, co-producers of the documentary Beethoven in Beijing. Welcome.
Hello, Susan. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Susan.
It's great to see you both, and this is an exciting documentary. Now, Sam, you are the co-founder of History Making Productions, which you founded in 2008 with your son, and the first great film that you made was Philadelphia, the Great Experiment. And since then, you have over 200 films and videos, I understand, on a variety of subjects.
Well, the most common subject, Susan, has been the history of Philadelphia. When Jennifer and I started working on Beethoven in Beijing, that was really the first time I pivoted to something that might have a more international or national interest. I think the audiences who've seen it have really loved.
And Jennifer, you have worked for 31 years at the Inquirer, and for 4 of those years lived in China. You're also the author of a memoir, Shanghai Faithful: Betrayal and Forgiveness in a Chinese Christian Family. So this film is an amazing film about telling the story of how classical music was reawakened in China after the Cultural Revolution and the role the Philadelphia Orchestra played in that reawakening. Why were each of you drawn to this project?
Susan, I was drawn to the project because of an assignment I had from the Inquirer in 2008. The paper asked me to go to China to cover a special anniversary concert that they were holding to celebrate the 35th anniversary of this historic 1973 tour. And the 2 classical music critics couldn't make the trip, so they asked me to go because I know my way around China. So I covered this concert. It was in the same venue as the 1973 concert. And, as I was interviewing Chinese concertgoers coming and going from the concert, I was really struck by the degree of affection that the Chinese audience seemed to have for the orchestra. So I went, I wrote my stories, came back to Philadelphia, and in the back of my head, I always thought, this would be a great documentary. This is a story that should be seen and heard, not just read about. So I pitched the orchestra when I left the Inquirer. I left the paper in 2014, pitched the orchestra about doing a documentary, and they had suggested that I might want to talk to Sam Katz because this is my first documentary and Sam has done hundreds. So I pitched it to Sam in 2015, and I'll let him take it from there because he wasn't immediately convinced of the idea.
No, I wasn't, but I had been trying to promote the idea of a documentary on the history of the orchestra. And the management of the orchestra had also simultaneously been hearing from Jennifer, and their preference was for the story of China, which is, of course, the contemporary orchestra perspective. And I was a little skeptical at first. I'd been to China on business and swore I would not want to go back. Not because I didn't like it, but because of the time zone and all of that. But time zone change. But I was very impressed by Jennifer Lin. And I grew up going to children's concerts and hearing classical music in my home, and maybe 25 or 30 years ago made it the center of my musical interest. So the idea of doing something like this, which was Philadelphia, but not about Philadelphia, was pretty exciting. And Jennifer's acumen and understanding of the story and her success and reputation at the paper made this not a hard choice.
So Jennifer, how would you describe the story? Because there are so many different stories.
Yeah, there are a lot of chapters to this story that we're telling, but really what we do is we use 1973 as a starting point to show how there's been this revival of classical music in China, and that this is energizing the entire world of music. So, when you look at this, the music scene today, all the top orchestras in the world include Beijing and Shanghai on their tours nowadays. New York goes there on a regular basis. Cleveland has been there, Detroit, LA, you name it. But the Philadelphia Orchestra now has been to China 12 times, which is more than any American orchestra. A lot of people, Susan, know about ping pong diplomacy, which is when the American table tennis team went to China, and that kind of opened the door a crack. But really, music diplomacy has had just, as big an impact, arguably, and a more lasting impact on U.S.-China relations. So that was something that intrigued me, and was one of the reasons why I wanted to make the film. And plus, I mean, you could read about this history, but you really have to hear it and see the orchestra, and not only the history of 73, but kind of what's happening today. That was our goal.
Right. So were there any questions you wanted answered? I mean, you know this, when you go into a project like this, and you know you're going to be doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people, you sort of have an idea, I suppose, of the story you want to tell, but then were there questions that you wanted to answer that you weren't sure about?
Yeah, well, the overarching one is, why is classical music so popular in China today? And we try to explain that in the movie. I mean, there are a couple of factors, but among them are the fact that there was a lot of pent-up demand. So, there were orchestras and classical musicians in China before 1949, but any sort of performance of Western classical music was denied after the start of the Cultural Revolution. So it was really repressed. So there was this pent-up interest. So once Mao died, the Cultural Revolution ended, that pent-up demand really, exploded. So there was that. And then also in the 1980s, there was the economic boom in China, giving people more disposable income to spend on their only children. And then I think the third factor that we touch on in the film is how China has really invested in music, not only hard assets like concert halls and conservatories, but also music education.
Right. So Sam, did you have the same sort of approach or thinking about this?
Well, you start a project, a documentary always starts with a thesis about what the story is about. But the reality is that as you peel back the layers and talk to people, you find out the story might not be about what you thought. And I think to the extent that the Chinese value culture and classical music particularly as evidence of their status as a nation, and which has resulted in the investment that Jennifer just mentioned in education. Parents want their children to be able to do something spectacular, to be stars. But of equal importance to me was the fact that at a scientific university and engineering school, they hired a head of a music department and require students in graduate school to take music courses because they saw music in the same way that they saw technology and engineering and mathematics as something to develop the whole person. And I think that's a very exportable idea, because we used to have in Philadelphia, particularly, one of the finest public education music curricula in the country, which helped produce some of the great musicians of Philadelphia. And of course, whenever there's a budget cut, art and music are at the top of the list. That's not the case in China. They commit to it. So that was a really important, to me, important story. And then to see Lang Lang helping Philadelphia public schools expand their exposure to music through his foundation represents kind of a different way for the cultural impact to come back to the United States. And that felt very powerful to me.
Right. It's kind of ironic that the Philadelphia Orchestra helped reignite interest in classical music in China in 1973. And all these years later, China is serving as a model for America in how to keep classical music thriving in our country.
Well, when we talked to one person who made the comment that they didn't see the value of exploring the Chinese lessons because China was authoritative and they dictated what was in the curriculum. And of course, that's what school boards and school districts are supposed to do, is to determine the curriculum. So I disputed that point of view. And I think that when you go to the Thomas Holm Elementary School and you listen to the principal who's in the film, you know that the impact is not just academic, it's very emotional, and the kids love it, the parents love it. And that's where I grew up. I was made to go to the Academy on Saturday. I was, let's go to the Academy of Music to see the orchestra. But I went, and I heard it in the house, and we didn't have earbuds. We hope the film generates more interest and hopefully exposure to this form of culture, which is so prominent in the city.
Right. Well, why focus on Beethoven?
Well, Susan, so Beethoven is kind of a leitmotif through the film. It's not really about Beethoven, but Beethoven stands in for classical music in general. And through the film, though, it is a thread. There was this big debate when Ormandy got to China over whether they would play Beethoven's Fifth or Beethoven's Sixth. The wife of Chairman Mao insisted on Beethoven's Sixth. And Ormandy was not real happy with that because he had prepared to play the Fifth. He didn't have the scores for the Sixth, and he told us, or he didn't tell us, but he said at the time, I hate the Sixth. I don't want to play it. But he was convinced to come around through the work really of a diplomat who was on the ground at the time. His name is Nick Platt. And Nick Platt had the unfortunate duty of breaking the news to Ormandy that he wasn't going to be playing the Fifth, that he would be playing the Sixth for the big concert that they had where Madame Mao attended. And then the film ends with this wonderful moment from, let's see, what year was it? 2017, when Yannick performed Beethoven's Ninth in Beijing with a choir from the National Center for Performing Arts. So we end with a big ta-da, and it's Beethoven's Ninth. So really, Beethoven serves as stand-in for classical music in general.
The Chinese understood that Beethoven was himself a revolutionary. And at the beginning of the revolution, which of course goes back to the late 40s, Beethoven symbolized a person who rose up against authority, and both in his musical style, in the story of how he started the Eroica as a enthusiast of Napoleon, and as he watched him become emperor and build an empire, a critic of Napoleon. And when Madame Mao said this orchestra couldn't play the Fifth, she would have to have known what the Fifth was. And so we know that before 1949, Western classical music was very prominent in China, and Beethoven was a very important revolutionary character.
Another thing that's so surprising when you watch the film is the kind of assets that you have. The tapes from 1973 with Nixon and Ormandy and Kissinger. How did you get all those assets?
So Susan, my background is reporting. I don't pretend to be a classical music expert. So one of the fun things about this project was the hunt for audio, which is different for me because I'm a newspaper reporter at heart. And so we found a lot of archival video on the Nixon Library website. So when we talk about Nixon's visit to China, the library has made available to anyone a lot of film coverage of that trip. And so in looking at the website, I found audio files. Now, luckily for us, Nixon was pretty obsessive about taping Oval Office conversations, and the library has made all those available to the public. So I did a little, reverse engineering and figured out when did they announce that they were going to China, in 1973, and then narrowed it down to a week in February, and lo and behold, we found this audio of the phone call. And Sam, do you remember when I called you? I was like so excited.
Yes,
I was like jumping for joy. So the library actually provided a lot of resources for us.
It was very meaningful because I was a Watergate groupie, and of course it was those tapes that brought Nixon down. But I also am very proud of the capacity of our company as a archival, resourceful organization, particularly our archivist, John Cole, to find things that were not generally known to be available. We had also great access to the orchestra's archives and the Ormandy collection. And then we got a lot of home movies. Nick Platt took a lot of movies when he was in China, living there. And we were also able, I think, to capture some spectacular archival musical assets for the film. And lastly, there was a reporter from WCAU-TV, back then it was a CBS affiliate, who went to China with the orchestra, Cotty Martin, who is well known, and Cotty's documentary, her news reporting for the trip, was an asset of CBS, and then that station was acquired by NBC. And then we had to deal with both networks to get the rights to use the film, which you see when you see Madame Mal being interviewed. That's Cotty Martin. And when she pushes the camera away, that's Cotty's camera. So that took a long time, about a year and a half to get the licensing organized for that. And that was really critical to this film because she was the only camera in 1973.
It really must be a challenge when you're telling a story that goes back so many decades. And it's fascinating because you not only have lots of great interviews with current orchestra musicians or recently retired musicians who were on the 73 tour, but you get the response and the feeling and the reaction of the Chinese people themselves. And that really kind of gives a whole nother dimension to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really something you have to experience, Susan. To be in a Chinese concert hall, there is a lot of enthusiasm and warmth. When you go to a concert, you notice a lot of families with, parents with younger children, a lot of, people who seem to be on dates, that sort of thing. So it's very much an event. But we were so fortunate. The orchestra gave us, extraordinary access, not only to the concerts, but also to rehearsals and to backstage. So, I mean, my favorite moments are when we kind of capture that creative process or capture moments that convey kind of the work of being an orchestra on tour.
I felt that some of the things that Jennifer did had a particular impact on humanizing the story. Obviously, the opportunity that we had to spend time with Tan Dun and to be given access to the video that he shot in Hunan province when he was creating a multimedia presentation of his symphony Nushu was probably one of the best experiences for all of us. And the family footage from Pang Pang of growing up in a family whose parents had their pianos taken away and their scores burned, and then see in the family's stand-up piano how this child acquired a musical intellect that has turned him into a symphonic composer. I think those kinds of stories have helped make this more than just kind of a musical documentary, but one that really captures the human spirit around the creative instinct.
And it's also interesting that sometimes you think of when an orchestra goes on tour and they're playing in concert halls, they're playing to audiences who have privilege within their own country. But you also talk in the film about Tan Dun, for example, hearing music over a loudspeaker. And that's something very unusual for us to think about.
Susan, when we set out to do the documentary, it wasn't apparent to us from the outset that Tan Dun would be such a major character. But as we kind of built the story, we realized, his personal story kind of encapsulates what we were trying to convey. And that is that in 1973, he was a teenager. He had been sent to the countryside to work on a commune, as everyone in his generation had been. And back then in China, people didn't have access to radios and TV or even to newspapers. So you got your information from the daily broadcasts on the loudspeaker in the commune. And he tells the story about working in the fields and hearing a report about the Philadelphia Orchestra being in the country and hearing just snippets of Beethoven's Fifth and Sixth. And it kind of blew his mind. So fast forward to 2014, he's now an Oscar Grammy-winning composer and created his masterpiece, Nushu. And the Philadelphia Orchestra took it to his hometown to perform it in a theater that was not necessarily ready for prime time. So it kind of brings the story full circle. And it's also this idea that we try to convey in the film about, you know, back in 1973, this cultural bridge was basically going in one direction with, you know, American, Western orchestras going to China. But now it's very much a two-way street, a two-way bridge. And we intentionally end it with the concert in 2019 in Philadelphia, where the Philadelphia Orchestra performed in a side-by-side with the Shanghai Philharmonic. And they performed a piece by this young Juilliard-trained composer, Peng Peng. So it's kind of the evolution that we're trying to show.
Right.
One of the other things, Susan, that I want to comment about, to Jennifer's credit, and Sharon Mullally, our co-director, and Rachel Stewart, our editor, is that the use of animation. Animation in documentary is not unusual. It's certainly something others have done, but there are many parts of the story where we had no imagery, neither still nor motion. And without that imagery, there was really nothing to put on the screen. And Jennifer and Sharon and Rachel were very, very adamant about doing animations, and I was very adamant about not doing them. And so there was a lot of tension over that issue. They created a draft, if you will, which was the first time that Jindong Chai goes to his friend's home to hear a symphony. They have to take the shades down, and he puts it on a phonograph, a monograph phonograph, and plays a symphony. And then the disc turns into all kinds of other things and ends up next to the wheels on the wheels of a bicycle. And when I saw it, I said, okay, we're doing animations.
Sharon Mullally, the co-director, was the one who pushed for the animation. And like Sam, I was skeptical. And, you know, Sharon has worked on more than 20 feature films, and this is my first. So I had to kind of defer to her. But it's interesting. We actually Googled animation, Chinese brush style, and we came up with Jacob Rivkin, who is a local animator in Philadelphia and had actually studied art in China. So Jacob was our animator, and I'm just thrilled with the results of his work. It really added to the story and enabled us to tell the story in a way that would have been difficult if we didn't have animation.
Right. Well, I was going to comment on it because it was such a fun storytelling technique, and it really brought you into it in a whole different way. Is it possible to say what's touched you the most about this story?
Yeah, well, what touches me the most about the story is always the same thing whenever I watch it, which is how beautiful the music is, and how the music is so well woven into the human fabric of the characters. And what's also touched me is how successful it's been.
The moment that I'll never forget, it actually didn't make it into the film because we didn't have a camera on this person at the time, but for the concert in Beijing for Beethoven's Ninth, there was an older Chinese couple that attended as our guest, and they had been, you know, in 1973, they had been members of the Central Philharmonic in China and had met the Philadelphia Orchestra in Ormandy. There's this one scene where the Philadelphians go to the Central Phil to watch one of the rehearsals, and this couple, he plays the oboe, she plays the violin, they were there. And so in 2017, they went to the concert of Beethoven's Ninth, which was just, I mean, incredibly stirring. And we actually caught the husband and the wife on camera in the audience giving a standing ovation. And so when they left the concert hall, I remember we were in a hallway there at the National Center for Performing Arts, and the husband was in tears. He said, I've never heard anything like that. And so it's moments like that, you know, I'll really cherish.
I'm not a director, and I didn't participate in the actual filming or interviewing. I just was the producer, but I did have one directorial moment that I'm very proud of. Lang Lang was rehearsing for the 2016 concert, Rachmaninoff's first piano concerto. And when they took their break, which, you know, they take every 50 minutes, I wandered over because I knew Lang Lang when he was a kid. We chatted a little bit, and then Yannick walked over, and they started talking about how Yannick wanted him to play it. And I screamed, to our director of photography, who was maybe 20 yards away, and our audio guy, "Get over here." And for a few minutes, we captured Lang at the piano and Yannick with his hands and his movement. Yes, 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 no, no, no. And I thought, whoa, that was a really good moment. That was the highlight for me of actually the process of making the movie, because it was the only part that I was actually directly involved in.
And a good part it was.
And you see all the hard work that goes into even making this beautiful music.
And the point is, you got to also be a little lucky.
Right. Wow. So does this film today, do you think it's particularly relevant to our times today?
I do. I mean, there's a lot that divides us as nations, the United States and China. And this is going to sound cliche and hokey, but music connects us. And so I think we need to stay engaged as countries. Otherwise, we're going down a very dangerous path. So music is one way of maintaining connections.
And the relations between People's Republic of China and the United States of America are in jeopardy of collapsing. Not just because of a political point of view, but because we seem unable to figure out how to be coexistent. And they engage in activities that are quite anti-American in cyber security and across a range of other things. So, you know, the fact that there are these human connections, that culture is the means to try to keep them alive, gives you the possibility that these might be platforms from which to rebuild global relations between the two most important countries in the world, one of which is becoming closer to the most important country in the world, and it isn't us. And that's going to require a lot of skill. And Philadelphia Orchestra has provided a great vehicle to keep those doors open.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Sam, for giving us a few minutes of your time, and congratulations on making this beautiful film, Beethoven in Beijing.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for your interest. It's been fun.
Thank you, Susan. It was great to be with you.